All right, today we're going to look at how I prep my files for dev handoff, both at our component and UI level as well. So we're going to go through a real simple checklist together, and I'll unblur each of these different checks as we proceed through this video. I'll also put this checklist component as a free download on uicollective.co. Link will be in the description. And again, as we're going through this as well, if your organization or you do things a different way, maybe you have some things that I'm forgetting, feel free to leave a comment in the description. You know, dev handoff is a really complex topic, so let's make it a conversation together. With that said, let's get started. So to start, one thing I always like to start with before I hand anything off to developers is functional QA. So this is the first step of our checklist. So functional QA is not necessarily so much specific to developers, but also to designers as well. But again, design and dev often comes hand in hand. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to start with some functional QA that you might do for something like a component, like a snack bar component, before we move in to some functional QA that you might see on just some, I guess, sample UI that I have right here. So nothing fancy. We'll take it nice and slow. So here I just have an instance of our main snack bar component itself. And I can see on the right-hand side here, you know, we have the ability to change the status from things like information or success, toggle on and off the title, the description, make adjustments to the link, add icons to the link, all that fun stuff. But one thing I'm noticing here is that you don't have the option to hide this closable icon. Again, what if you want the snack bar to be timed? So after 10 seconds, that snack bar disappears and the user doesn't have the option to turn it off or hide it. So what I'm actually going to do then is add a closable. So here I'm going to select one, use the select matching layers tool, and then add a layer property, which I'm going to call closable. So now in my instance, I can see that I now have the ability to hide that closable icon. And again, so when it comes to your components, like undergoing functional QA like this to make sure that your components work the way that you want them to work is necessary not only for developers, but for your designers as well. Another thing you might look for here as an example is to make sure that things collapse as planned. Again, you don't want things, or often don't want things, passed to developers that have a fixed width like that. You know, you want things to be responsive because the developers will build them as a fixed width. So that said, let's look at a sample UI here. So again, it's nothing fancy. It's just, again, something quick just for the purpose of this exercise. We just sort of have this sample onboarding page right here. So let me move that main component off to the side here. And I can see that if I extend it out, I can see that the text doesn't respond with it. So that's part of that responsiveness when you're undergoing that functional QA that I just mentioned. So what I'm going to do here so the developers don't build it as a fixed width is set this to fill. And then I can see that that text now becomes responsive. Again, looking at things like responsiveness, alignment, as you can see right here, super critical when you're undergoing your functional QA before you pass anything off to your developers. One thing that is also specific to designers as well that I often tend to look for is things like nested instances. So if I hit this main component here, I don't have any options to change those properties. I would actually have to click in to the subcomponents themselves in order to access those properties. So in order to make things easier for my designers, what I like to do is add those nested instances, toggle those on. So now when I just hit this component once, I can see that I have all of those different properties for me to choose from. So those are some things I like to look for when it comes to the functional QA. So really just stress testing your components and your designs, looking for things like responsiveness. So what we're going to do first is let's set this to selected, and then let's move on to our second step. Now let's look at making sure that our tokens in Token Studio are actually applied. If you're not using Token Studio, feel free to go towards the next section of this video. And if you are using Token Studio, this is super, super important. Sometimes, regardless if, let's look at an example here. So I can see that this has our text body color. So oftentimes what I see is just because the variable is applied, that designers often assume that the token is also applied with it. And that's not always the case. Sometimes your token might not be applied, but your variable is applied. So if you then go to update the token in Token Studio, that change will not get pushed down towards your components or your element in your UI. So what I actually like to do is go through each of these individual items and make sure that our token is applied. So in this case, our snack bar title is using the text information. I can see that that's highlighted. our text is using text body color, I can see that that's highlighted, so on and so forth. So before you pass anything off to your developers, it's always a good idea to go through each of your different components and make sure that the token is also applied with it. Not only does that help with you, but that can also cause a lot of confusion if it is not with your developers as well. So again, if you are using Token Studio, be sure to go through each of your different elements and make sure that that token is also applied along with that variable. Okay, so now that we have our Token Studio applied, let's go and set that to selected. And now let's look at our dark and light mode check. This is really great before we get into things like looking at our different contrasts and to make sure that our components and our UIs look as beautiful as they do on dark mode as they do in light mode or vice versa. So what I like to do with this is I actually like to create what I call sticker sheets. And I've got a completed example that I'll show here in just a sec. So just as an example here, what I like to do is call this our light mode. And then what I'm going to do is copy this and then call this dark. And then what I like to do is wrap these in an overall frame, which I call our stickers. And I've got a completed example here, which I'll show in just a second. So then what I do with each of our different elements is change this to our dark mode and then set the backgrounds to black. And I compare the two. You don't want, it's sort of like a first pass to see if you've set up your dark mode correctly. You don't want your text to still be that dark black color. You want it to stand out nicely. And what a completed sticker sheet looks like is something like this, where you have all of your different states, your different modifiers, so that your developers can come in and see the different modifiers at different states, everything at once the way it's intended to be shown, both for your light mode and also for your dark mode as well. And this serves as a really great basis point as to how we'll conduct things like our contrast checks, so on and so forth. So there we have our dark and light mode check out of the way. So let's turn this to selected and let's keep moving forward. Next, what we like to do is run our design system tracker. Now, our design system tracker is actually a plugin that we built here at UI Collective. It's a free plugin to use. There are some paid elements to it, but the functionality that I'm showing you here, this is included in the free version. So what I like to do is essentially just select individual components or frames. Essentially what I'm doing is looking for any unlinked styles, color variables, or text styles. Because the items that are unlinked, that could cause some issues with your development team as they're building out those components or those UIs. So I can see here right away that there's no unlinked styles, and there's no styles at all because we're using variables. All of our color variables are local to this individual file. If you're using colors from a design system that you subscribe to, it will say remote, and that's fine as well. But really, we're just looking for that there's nothing that's been unlinked or broken. So all of our colors look great, but I do notice that this text style is unlinked. So let's go ahead and highlight that. So as I can see right here, it's this subtext that doesn't have a style applied to it. So what I would do then is either apply my style, or if I'm using Token Studio, what I can do is go into our tokens and then simply apply that style. So this should be our type body medium. Now this is strange, and this is sort of what I was hinting at earlier, is that sometimes there can be a break. A variable might be applied, but the token might not be applied, or vice versa. And this is a real great example. So it's showing that there's no style applied, but in Token Studio, it is showing that it is applied. So what I'm going to do is just hit it once, hit it again, and now I can see they're connected. So it's our body medium, and it's showing selection in Token Studio. So now if I go ahead and open up our design system tracker once again, select this component, scan, I can see that everything is local and local as it should be. And I can also select frames as well. So if I open up our design system tracker once again, scan this, nothing in color styles, everything appears local. And if you're subscribed to a design system, everything should say remote, and all our text styles look great as well. So now that we have that out of the way, let's set that to selected, and we're going to move on to the next step. All right, so next what we like to look for is our contrast, to make sure that our contrast meets our accessibility standards. So we like to use this great plugin called Contrast, and what you can actually do is just select different elements. So in this case, let's select the text. I can see what the contrast ratio is, if it passes AA or AAA at the normal text level, at the large text level, and also for things like graphics as well. So I can see here that our text, everything seems to pass. We usually look for AA, but if your organization requires a AAA pass, it offers that option as well. So what I like to do is really just go through each of the different elements and just make sure that everything passes. Oops, I lost our plugin here. Everything passes our accessibility checks. So before we hand everything off to developers, we're confident the colors and the tokens that we're using and that our designs are actually accessible so that a developer doesn't need to go in a little bit later on and actually adjust those colors. So what this would look like if it doesn't pass accessibility is I have this example here where I can see that we have this darker text on this darker background, and I can see that this actually fails. So although I adjusted it just for the purpose of this exercise, you want your text to always pass your accessibility. And that's the same with graphics as well. Things like your icons here, I can see that when it comes to that graphics level, it passes that AA, which is what we're looking for, but it fails our AAA normal text, which is not necessary for the purpose of this because this is an icon, and we like to look for our AA, not our AAA, because that's usually the industry standard. So there's just a quick overview of how we like to check our contrast. So let's go ahead and set this to selected, and let's move on to the next step. So next what we look for is that all of our layers are actually named. So when a developer is going through, they'll know what those layers are actually referring to. So as an example, let's look at this snack bar right here, and let's look closely. So things that we want to avoid are where we see frame 1, frame, or something that's not very descriptive like text. In this case where we have our title, that's super clear because the developer is knowing that is what that is referring to. But for things like text, what does that text actually mean? What kind of text is that for? So we could change this to something like our description. Where we have frame, we could call this our content frame because it contains all of our different contents. And then our outer frame, we could also call this, content and icon or and icon. There's a lot of things that we can do here. So when it comes to naming your layers, ask your developers, have an open conversation with them around how they would like layers to be named, whether it's a content block, whether it's a text element. Keep that dialogue open with your developers when naming your layers to make sure you're all aligned on different naming conventions as well. And that's a little teaser into the next part of this video. But first, before I forget, we're all done with our layers. Let's move on to the next part now. So closely aligned with the naming of our layers is making sure that our property names are consistent. And again, as I mentioned in the last part of this video, ask your devs how they would like those properties to be named. What makes sense in their eyes so that as they're going through, they'll know what each of those properties are referring to and the type of naming conventions that they like to use. So as an example, let's look at our snack bar components right here. So one thing I noticed is that status is all lowercase, but our title has that capital T. Everything else has that capital as the first letter of the word itself. So what I'd actually like to do then is make it consistent throughout. So I'm going to change status to have a capital S. Even with the individual variants themselves, if we look in, information is all lowercase, but success and warning are not, and error is also all lowercase. So what I actually like to do is set all of our variant names to lowercase. And again, this is what works well when collaborating with our developers here at UI Collective and building up design systems. So we like to have all of our values all lowercase, but the name of the property, those properties themselves, start with an uppercase letter. But again, have that conversation with your developers around the types of naming conventions that they would like to use. So now that we have our property names, all of those are consistent. Let's set that to selected. And then lastly, let's move on to the last part. All right, so now let's look at our documentation, which is really one of the last steps that we like to have before we pass anything off, mark it as complete, hand it off to our developers. Now, one thing that I would like to preface with is your documentation, both at your component level and also your annotations, should be done in collaboration with your developers. It's always helpful to book your developers for an hour, half an hour, whatever it is, go through the documentation, go through the annotations, and even as you're building out, both. Feel free to collaborate with your developers, get their thoughts on it as you go along. Again, things like this should never really be done in silo. So when it comes to our component documentation itself, what we like to have is something as simple as a last updated. So if I'm a designer or developer who's coming in and seeing that documentation was last updated, 2-3 years ago, maybe it's time to chat with our design team in order to rework some of that documentation, whether it's based on new accessibility standards, so on and so forth. When this component is used for, the status of it, which can be done with dev mode now, and also its usage guidelines. So what the structure is used for, some design considerations, and also accessibility considerations as well. And again, this is super important to involve your development team because they might also have some content that they'd like to have or add so that their developers have something to reference, and that could also help the design team as well. Now, that's at the component level. When it comes to the actual UIs themselves, I like to add these little notes here, and I like to number them. So as an example, note 1, inside this phone, play the video provided in the phone mockup automatically upon landing on this page. So this will allow the developer to imagine in their mind and build it accordingly how this functionality should work. Another example, 2, when clicked, serve the specific pop-up. So oftentimes one thing I have noticed that sometimes some developers don't always go through the prototype too in depth or click every possible scenario. So it's always great to call it out as you're going. And additionally, by adding a number to this specific note, if a developer does have questions, they'll be able to say, hey, in specific to note 1 or note 2, which will allow you to know exactly what it is that they're referring to. So that is how we like to structure our documentation, both at our components and at our UI level as well. So when it comes to the actual file itself, there's lots of different combinations of things that you can do. You know, whether you have your components and your UIs in one file, your components in another file, and all your UIs in a separate file as well. But what I like to do is as following here. So now this approach, whether your design system is in one file or another one, doesn't really matter. What I like to do is have our design system, and then let's say underneath that, I have snack bar. And one thing I saw from Matt, who's one of our UI Collective community members, when I sort of asked everyone how everyone structures their files, their designs to hand off for devs, is Matt liked to add this arrow here underneath, letting the designer developers know that the snack bar is a part of the design system. This can also be at the UI level as well. Maybe these UIs are part of onboarding, so on and so forth. So I then go back into our prep file here, and let me just unlock everything. So what I like to do is bring this in, and then bring in our stickers as well, and then add those as such. So what I like to do here is I have my stickers, I then have my snack bar. So the developers would come here and read that, oops, one thing I didn't do before is mark that our documentation is good to go. So let's set that to selected. So if I'm a developer who comes in, I can see that the due diligence has been done with my designers. I have some documentation that I can read. I can see all of the different feedback states and modifiers that the snack bar should have before I have the main component itself. And sometimes one thing I also like to do as well is just section things off depending on how complex it is, although it's not necessarily really necessary. So just bring this in here into our, there we go, something like that. I can remove that fill. And then what I'm going to do is call the snack bar and then set this as ready for dev. But when it comes to components, sometimes what I often see too is really, you don't really have that section as you just have this as well. You know, whatever works with you. But we're going to stick it in there for now because one thing I do like to see is just this ready for dev. And then if I go back into our prep, and let's say I have our UIs, so then we might go with our designs themselves. And again, labeling and everything can change, and maybe offer, let's maybe go with our onboarding. And then again, let's add another arrow. And again, this is all really personal preference, how things work in your organization, how your design files are structured. It's totally up to you. And then I also like to section things off as well. Maybe you might have different versions of your onboarding here. You don't want your developers to get mixed up on. You want them to focus on one. And then I'm going to call this our onboarding, and then set this as ready for dev once I have done those checks. So a developer knows that this section is ready for development as well. So there you have it. That's how I like to structure things in terms of working with my developers and prepping things for my developers, or even some designers on my team as well. Now, again, let's keep this dialogue open. If you do things a different way at your organization, feel free to leave a comment. Let us know in Slack, email me. You know, maybe we can include your suggestions, your approach in another video as well for everyone in the community and online. So thanks for watching today's video. Thanks so much for watching today's video, everyone. Just want to encourage everyone to sign up for UI Collective and join our community. And we're actually soft launching our community platform today, where designers at UI Collective will be able to come in, build a quick profile, just share a little bit about themselves, why it is they want to join UI Collective, and then join the community from there. So once you join our community, you'll get access to our Slack community with over 1,000 plus design experts. We're also giving away to all those who build their profile and join the community access to all 60 plus of our courses on component building for absolutely free. And we're also going to keep adding more and more perks to all community members as well. This platform is still just a soft launch, so we're also going to host our events to this platform as well, and lots of great other things. So join UI Collective, add some items to your profile, join the community, and hope to see you online. If you have any feedback on this platform or me specifically on more content that we can include, just feel free to drop those in the comments, and hope to see you at the next video.